Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller, and welcome to Scratching the Surface. On the show with me today is Fleur Watson. Fleur is the Executive Director and Chief Curator at the Centre for Architecture Victoria and Open House Melbourne, and is the author of a really terrific new book, The New Curator, Exhibiting Architecture and Design. Through a series of case studies and interviews, the new curator surveys contemporary design practice to understand what it means to curate design and architecture today. Featuring many people who have been on this show before, like Eric Chin, Paola Antonelli, Dayan Sujic, Prem Krishnamurthy, and others, Fleur positions design curating as less about objects and individual designers and more about process, research, and collaboration. It's a great book that felt very much in dialogue with so many of the big themes that I tackle on this show. Fleur's background is in design practice before she quickly moved into writing and editing. She was an editor-in-chief of Monument magazine in Australia and served as a curator at the Design Hub Gallery at RMIT. In this conversation, Fleur and I talk about what the new curator is and the various curatorial moves that she identifies in the book. We talk about the expanding natures of both design and curatorial practices, as well as the evolution of her own career, thinking through her work as both curatorial and design. It's a great conversation, I think, and I just can't recommend her book enough. If you like the show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans. They give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, transcripts, and exclusive interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface and you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to help support the show. Thanks for listening, and here's my conversation with Fleur Watson. I want to start this conversation talking about your new book, which is called The New Curator, Exhibiting Architecture and Design, which I read and I loved. It's such a great book and covers so many things that I'm interested in. And what you do in this book is you sort of identify these different types of curatorial practice, or these curatorial moves, as you call them. The curator as space maker, as interloper, as a speculator. And you kind of identify these and talk about what each of these are. But what was interesting to me in reading the book is how each of these moves, one thread that ties them all together is that they're all moves away from thinking about curation or kind of curating architecture and design, away from looking at singular objects and looking at process, at research, at at kind of ranges of practices as opposed to artifacts. And I'm curious if you could talk about that move and how you've maybe thought about that as a way of kind of thinking about what the new curator is or will be.
Well, thanks, Jarrett. It's firstly so great to know that you've read and loved the book. Thank you.
Of course.
And definitely, you're absolutely right. The book is, I guess, somewhat provocatively titled The New Curator. And in that provocation, it's certainly not intended as setting up a binary between new forms of curating and old forms of curatorship. And it's certainly not my intention to reject the scholarship and custodianship of traditional modes of curation and cultural production. But it does, it's grappling with this idea of exploring, discussing, investigating these kind of emerging curatorial methodologies and what I call moves, as you say. And that has a deliberate porosity, I guess. There's a kind of sense of understanding contemporary curatorship for architecture and design specifically in relationship to both the changing nature of design practice itself and the complexity and diversity of the conditions in which design practice is responding. So in that way, this kind of way that the changing role of practice itself is happening, obviously architecture and design has always been a very collaborative process of conceptualizing, experimenting, documenting, advocating, prototyping. But it is also grappling with its role in some of the kind of big challenges that we face as a community. So the book is really cited in that context, and really as this kind of expanded form of creative practice itself. I think in that way too, one of the biggest shifts is thinking through how the audience is brought very much into this discussion. So rather than the curator acting as a kind of voice of authority, a custodian, a kind of educational voice, if you like, or placing something within a canon, it's actually really grappling with this much more active exchange with audiences, and in that way this porosity starts to come in. It's much more about asking questions perhaps than it is in terms of providing answers, and it's really saying that the audience is a really key part of that conversation, a part of the equation, and that curating is not an activity that can take place in isolation. It needs the audience to be part of discovering what is happening, both in contemporary practice, but also within the exhibition space itself, if we think about it as a site for experimentation. So that's the kind of territory that the book is sitting in, and kind of, trying to, in some ways, again, not fix the landscape, but
Right.
certainly kind of bring it together through both my own research, but also these other conversations that thread through the book, which are a really important part of its composition.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting to hear you kind of frame it that way, especially around this idea of collaboration, because the book, your name is on the cover actually, obviously, and I'm talking to you about it, but there are these conversations which you are not a part of. It's two other curators talking to each other, and then you have these really great case studies throughout. Some you worked on, some that you didn't. And so the book itself is a type of curatorial project or a type of collaboration also. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of about, the idea of getting these ranges of voices in here to build to this kind of thesis that you're proposing?
Yeah, the book really came out of reflecting on my own practice over the past 20 years, which was very much cited in Australia, generally, and outside the conventions of the museum or the gallery. So
Mm,
in modes such as publishing, festivals, public space, and then more recently, or certainly over the last decade, in this kind of space of research and a kind of lab-like project space. And so the book, through my own PhD, kind of reflected on that practice. But I think more interestingly for me, the process of the PhD also started to bring together a community of practice. The more I looked
mm,
um, around my own practice, which was, I should say very clearly, has always been inherently collaborative, right from the get-go. So I think the book really articulates that there's also, a slight critique of the idea of the kind of not only the
mhm.
star architect but the star curator,
Yeah, yeah, totally.
and that doesn't really exist, certainly not in my practice. And the more I talk to other people who I responded to or admired or respected, that was very clear that their own practices were also very collaborative, and it was about kind of materializing ideas that were often in process. So really it was about, the more I kind of post PhD started to think about producing a book, it felt to me absolutely inherent in the project that these other voices came into it, and that it wasn't about me having individual conversations with those other people, that it was actually about bringing people together with people that they felt were interesting to have a conversation with, and threading that through the book in some ways, as these kind of extra layers, but also in ways that expanded beyond my own position. So I think you're absolutely right that it is a kind of curatorial, project in its own sense. And Diane Sujik kind of talks about that in the introduction. It is this
Yeah.
kind of sense of bringing these people together in their own voices, their own positions as a whole, to start to kind of frame up something that is very much still in flux and changing all the time.
I think that's exactly right. And speaking of Dan, who I had on the show a while ago, in the intro, I'm going to quote him for a second. He writes, "The new curator is busy working on ways to redefine the subject of design. In that sense, this book is as much about the practice of design as it is about curating design. An alternative form of practice has opened up for the designer. It is significant to see how certain designers use the format of the exhibition as a means of focusing their research." And I think he's onto something there. And I think it is interesting to think about how these new moves in curating are reflecting changes in design generally. And I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about that, and specifically about the relationship between the designer and the curator, and kind of where the curator sits in that relationship. And especially as it's kind of where the curator sits kind of in between the designer and an audience, where the curator is kind of sitting with the designer and commissioning things. How do you see the overlap between curation and design, I guess, is really the question that I'm kind of asking, or the relationship between the act of the curator and the acts of the designer?
Well, certainly the book is reflecting on a certain position around this kind of more responsive form
Mhm.
of curation. And I think we can see, if we look quite clearly even now, that wide spectrum still very much exists. There are contemporary curators who are very much working in a more traditional mode of, looking at a life's work, making sense of it,
Mhm.
perhaps bringing
Mhm.
it into the contemporary. And I think Paola Antonelli in the book makes that point, that, it's really important not that we don't discount that form of curatorial practice.
Right.
And certainly I would absolutely agree. I think, certainly the book is grappling with perhaps a different type of curatorial practice, which is what I would kind of call a much more rapid form
Mm.
of curatorial practice. And certainly in my own work, I've, for one reason or another, always seemed to work in that mode, in
Mm.
that things are happening quite quickly. You're responding to something that is happening around you at the time, and you're, in some respects, the curator's role in that process is much more perhaps involved, as though it were a design practice itself, but always kind of stepping out to that point of being able to be the trusted guide, the translator into that audience connection, that exchange with the audience. So maybe it's helpful to speak to a particular project. In the book, I talk about an exhibition that I worked on quite recently, actually, with a number of other people in the mix. Naomi Stead, who's a
Mm.
well-known architect and activist here, as well as my curatorial colleague, Kate Rhodes, and Pierre Edney Brown, on an exhibition called Workaround.
Right.
Um, and that exhibition was really kind of talks to your point, really, because in many respects it was about women and design, and women who were working in a kind of more expanded field around design, and certainly in that activist mode. But they were practitioners, and I should say they weren't all women either, but predominantly around women-led practice. And it was really grappling with this idea of the kind of work that happens around the kitchen table, or the places in between, or the places between having a real job as an architect in an office, perhaps, and what happens outside. But it was also about this kind of galvanizing of these practices who were responding quite urgently to issues that they felt absolutely passionate about, whether that was moving through public space and safety for women, as well as non-binary, people who identify as non-binary, whether it was about trying to grapple with the kind of structures of professional practice and the kind of slowness to catch up with the need to support women having flexibility in their work. It was really galvanizing this movement that we could see happening around us. And in that way, it was really about the curators' ability to, I guess, bring what I would call these kind of two moves together, this kind of activist mode of practice that was really responding to the contemporary condition at the time, but also really providing a space and an articulation and a kind of materialization of this practice in the exhibition space itself. So in that way, we were kind of performing, if you like, almost acting as dramaturgs to allow these works to be materialized, but more importantly, kind of documenting them very rapidly and providing that documentation back to the practitioners who could then further that practice. So I think that example kind of speaks to this kind of curatorial practice. On one level, yes, you're still acting as that mediator into the public realm and kind of saying, look, these are a set of practices that are all doing things quite differently, but they're speaking to the way that women are practicing in an expanded form and in a kind of activist form, but they're all very different. And we're not trying to really kind of put a label on it or kind of articulate it in a defined way. We're saying something's happening here and it's interesting and we'd like to know more about it. And we're bringing these practitioners' practice to the kind of public sphere so you can understand it and perhaps respond to it and ask questions about it. And it can grow from there.
I have two questions around that may or may not be related. The first one is kind of directly to what you're talking about. And I think what's interesting, especially talking about this sort of kind of rapid response almost, is just how quickly, at least for those of us in the design field, our understandings of design and what design is are changing. And that goes back to this idea of like, design as an artifact, a sort of like, industrial design model almost, to now thinking about, systems and user interfaces and architecture. And then in like an architecture space, thinking about that as like space making and just the sort of concrete borders between disciplines are much blurrier. Our understanding of what is design is much blurrier. And I'm wondering if the curator in this sense is almost somebody who can stand, I don't know if I agree with this, and that's why I'm kind of like curious what you think. Someone who can kind of stand outside of that and start to make sense of it in some way. Is the curator actually, in this sense, a way to create a dialogue for people to better understand this work or better describe this work or give language to what design is today? Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's actually a really important question, because I think we are still really battling with that perception more broadly, specifically, in architecture. If we think, certainly here in Australia, architects, really are involved in such a very small percentage of public life. And
Mhm.
so that idea of expanded practice and the way that a design way of thinking, an architectural way of thinking, through both, your education as an architect or as a designer, but also as a practitioner, can be so valuable at so many different levels of the way that
Mm,
we think about how to organize our communities, but also how we envisage them to be better communities for everyone.
mm,
So I think there is, an absolute role for the curator in um, supporting that understanding of what we mean by expansive practice. Um, and of course, it's not to say that there is not, uh, a critical need for also building much better buildings, but also there's a critical need to think about beyond the iconic singular building and
Mhm.
its relationship to not only the buildings around it, but to public space, to community space, to landscape, to waterways, to the natural environment. And certainly here in Australia, where our built environment is on unceded land, how
Mhm.
we understand Indigenous ways of knowing in that practice, and how we acknowledge, certainly the trauma of the past in terms of that's unceded sovereignty. So they're all really big issues, and I think what is really apparent in many of these curatorial practices is how the role of the curator is kind of hand in hand with that expanding role of
Mhm.
design practice to actually really not kind of tell our communities how it is, but actually
Right.
to bring people into that conversation, because I think for many people they view architecture and design as something that's not for them.
Mm,
There
mhm.
is certainly a kind of sense of, or it's something that is akin to fashion. Um,
Right.
s- s- and we all know that fashion is also a much more interesting and expanded field as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, there's that kind of critical role I see as being kind of hand in hand with um, creating that active space, and not participation for participation's sake. I think there's many
Right.
points of the
Right.
book which are quite critical of that, but with a kind of intent, with an intent to actually create a shared space of exchange and meaning and understanding that design is a process that involves lots of people to actually come to um, whether it's a culmination or whether it's actually a series of steps that unfold a piece of research that continues. It kind of lies in that spectrum.
It's interesting to think about these ideas of it, sort of expanded practices around design and how, our definitions for design and what design is are becoming blurrier, and design in many ways has become this buzzword. It's like you want to be a design driven company, or designer is seen as something exclusive, like you were talking about, or people are talking about sort of designing looks or designing their brand on Instagram. And you write in the book about how the word curating has also become like that. Everybody's curating what's on their mantle, their Spotify playlists, their Instagram feeds. And I'm wondering if that sort of expanded idea of curation, or this kind of liberal use of the word curate has changed how you think about your job or what it means to be a curator.
Yeah, look, it's a it's a really good question as well. In terms of, yes, there is the kind of appropriation of the word
Mhm.
um, curator in all sorts of contexts, as you say. curating a menu or curating a playlist. I don't really have a problem with that, actually. It's the same way I feel a bit about kind of protecting, professional titles. I mean,
Right.
there's a point where, is that necessary if we really understand the contribution that is made? So I guess in my own work, and certainly the work that I see in the practitioners who have come around the book, whether that's in the conversation or whether it's through the case studies, there is a shift which is very clear between selecting or kind of choosing
Mm.
or bringing what I would kind of describe as this idea of the spectacle. I think
Mm-hmm.
there is a lot of pressure, particularly in the context of the way that cultural institutions, large and small, have to operate with limited funds and great competition for those funds. That there is a real pressure to kind of curate towards the spectacle, where everything is very much big and kind of brings lots of people, and it's kind of glossy and it's great for Instagram and all of those kind of things. And in a sense, I don't even necessarily have an issue with that, as long as the kind of ecosystem around it is rich
Mm-hmm.
across how we talk about, exhibit, mediate, kind of really kind of bring to the community at large different ways of coming at design practice more generally. I think if that ecosystem is strong, fine. I think where it gets really difficult is where the space to be more experimental, to kind of move beyond that lure of creating spectacle or programming for popularity. If there's not enough spaces and places and practices in which to do things that are riskier, that are more
Mm.
experimental, that might actually even fail. I mean, failure is a concept I talk about in the book. How do you curate an exhibition that might fail?
Right.
And I talk about that specifically in terms of a research project by Roland Snooks,
Mm.
which was the composite wing, which kind of formed what I would call the kind of designer's exhibit, or the main gesture of the exhibition
Yeah.
that I'm referencing. And really, there was a real sense that that project could very well fail. It was the first time this particular practitioner had produced a work at that scale. It was quite experimental.
Mm.
And we kind of thought about that, discussed it. We didn't have any great answers, but we did come together to curate collectively for that potential, because it was more important to take the risk.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, we produced a series of, we basically documented the process quite exhaustively in a way that would allow it to still be exhibitable should it fail. And
Right.
and I think those are really important moves within the moves, because if you don't have that freedom to take risks and to talk about things that are not yet fully formed, then you're missing that whole part of that ecosystem I was just talking about. And that's where the kind of responsiveness is happening. And that also feeds up into the kind of larger practices or institutions, and that whole ecosystem starts to feed itself, and we get a much more holistic practice and
Right.
a much richer picture in the public realm of what practice has to offer.
Yeah, I love that. That's so well said. I want to step back for a second and just talk a little bit about the evolution of your work more generally. And I'm kind of curious how you got into this space and kind of where some of these ideas developed. And so you've worked as a curator inside institutions. You mentioned earlier, in kind of festivals and things like that. You were editor of Monument magazine. How did you kind of get into this space? Where did the interest in architecture and design come from?
Yeah, well, I guess I feel inherently like I've always been a bit of a kind of outsider in that I was trained as a designer, um,
Okay.
but I pretty much moved straight into. I was always interested in I guess what I would now call an expansive practice, but
Hmm.
kind of going back quite a few years ago now. And I grew up in WA in Perth in Western Australia. I think which is very remote, but it has a kind of interesting creative community, small but
Mm.
very interesting. And I had always been interested in creative practice more generally, and so I started. I certainly trained as a designer, but really straight out of graduation, I started writing about design practice.
Mm.
Originally for Monument, actually.
Okay.
Then I kind of moved more into broadcasting. I worked for the national broadcaster for a little while, doing kind of what they broadly called arts, which meant that they didn't really know what. Um,
Right, of course.
and then I guess as I think Dan also mentions in the forward, it does feel like there is this loose trajectory
Yeah. Yep.
into design journalism more broadly, and so I went to work for a very small independent publisher, but who were doing really interesting publications at the time in Sydney. And there was a really fantastic kind of grassroots music magazine, a fashion magazine called Australian
Mm.
Style at the time, and Monument. And I went to head up Monument, and really I spent a very intense, really kind of all of us working well into the night, but really fantastic collegiate,
Yeah.
5 or 7 years at Monument. And that really kind of galvanized, I guess, my interest in not only writing and reflecting on architecture in the context of that magazine, but also its connection with other creative practices which were around me at the time. When I look back, was absolutely foundational in terms of how you cite um, architecture as a cultural practice, and
Mhm.
and thinking about that cultural practice in context of other creative practices around you, as I said, but also into that kind of greater social realm. What did it have to offer the
Mhm.
community more broadly? So that was really fundamental.
It's so interesting to hear that, and it's especially interesting to hear how much it kind of parallels my own work in graphic design. And I think it seems like you realized or moved into writing much quicker than I did. It took me a while to kind of admit that the more kind of writing critical side, expanded practice exactly is kind of where I wanted to be. And I like tried to make it work as like just a normal graphic designer for probably too long. But the reason I asked you that though is because I was curious if you see this work, whether it's curatorial or editorial or publishing, as a type of design practice now. Like, does that design education shape how you approach the work that you're doing today?
Yes, I think it does. And I think it's taken me a long time to get to that point. I do definitely see, I certainly identify myself as a curator, but I see that curatorial practice uh, and the way that I work is is absolutely informed by my early work and my training
Mm.
and my interest as a designer. And I think that really started to emerge for me out of the process of doing the PhD. There's quite an extraordinary professor here in Australia, although, he's originally from South Africa and the UK, called Liam Van Skyke,
Mm.
who
Mm-hmm.
talks about, and he's written the afterword in the book, and he's really fundamental in this idea about your spatial intelligence. That is, it is informed, your spatial intelligence, as he calls it, is really informed by your early experiences in life, both personal, but also your training, your education. So how
Mm-hmm.
those all come together really inform how you approach the world. And so I guess for a while, certainly in my early years working in more kind of curatorial, zones, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
kind of moving from publishing to festivals to things that were very ephemeral. Uh, I found myself really grappling with that, and I would certainly come across, even in my research, a certain kind of pushback from a more, I guess, conventional museological way of thinking. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why, I'm very clear to say in the book, and very strong now about the fact that I don't think those binaries are very useful. I think the
Right.
fact is that there is something kind of happening with these practitioners who come out of perhaps design practices or different backgrounds, where they do
Mm-hmm.
bring a different kind of energy and frame and take that is informed by what Leon would call their spatial intelligence. And that's how, that sounds kind of quite scholarly, over the top, but
Right.
actually it's born from experience, it's born from practice, and that's what Leon is very clear to articulate. It's those practice driven experiences that shape who you are in the world, and how you then understand the world. And so for me, that very collaborative way of working was very natural and very, I think, akin to a design process where,
Mm-hmm.
you're never doing something on your own. That kind of idea of the singular author, that we still grapple with, the kind of master architect or
Mm-hmm.
the master designer, is never that way. We know that, because it takes many minds and many people to come together, to create a work, particularly a building, let alone in the complexity of the conditions that we now find ourselves in. So I think, certainly, yes, I would say that I do see it as a form of design practice, but certainly I see that curatorial work as a inherent collaborator with that expanded field of design.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I think that's so interesting. I think it's a nice way to kind of wrap up this conversation also. So I'm going to ask you my final question, which is the question I use to end all of these. I'm just curious what you're reading right now.
What I'm reading right now,
Yes.
that's interesting. Oh, that's such a good question, because I'm actually in the middle of producing a book,
Oh.
which I'm not writing, I'm editing. So
Oh.
I've kind of suspended my personal reading,
Oh,
sadly,
wow.
and
Wow.
I'm doing lots of reading around a practice called Neeson Murcutt and Neil here,
Mm.
um, who are an extraordinary, you certainly wouldn't say emerging practice, but kind of maybe middle career practice, based in
Hmm.
Sydney. And so I'm doing a lot of reading about their work. We're kind of right in the middle of the process of making the book. So I'm doing some very fine detailed reading of an extraordinary essay by Anna Johnson and Richard Black on their work, and just kind of, I don't know whether you know, but we're still in lockdown here in
Yeah. Yeah.
Melbourne and Sydney. on the East Coast. And so I am absolutely delighting in these extraordinary Sydney landscapes and kind of projecting my mind into their work. But their work is absolutely embedded in what they would call settings or kind of sites, and this extraordinary kind of topography and natural landscape of Sydney and more broadly New South Wales. So that's where my head is with reading at the moment.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to lie, my heart sunk when you said that you had suspended your personal reading, but you redeemed yourself. That sounds so interesting and actually really nice. And sounds like a great project. We should talk again when the book is out. It sounds really interesting.
I'd love to.
Thank you so much for doing this. Like I said, I loved the book. It feels very in dialogue with things I think about on this show. And so thank you for writing it. Thank you for this great conversation. I thought it was really great. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. It's great to talk to you, Jarrett.
This episode was recorded on October 6th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.